Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the plight of the 168 Allied Airmen who found themselves imprisoned at Buchenwald concentration camp. It's something that even to this day, governments seem unwilling to admit to. But before we get started, I had a curious email the other week suggesting that I create another tier of patronage. I thought it a crazy idea. I could not comprehend that level of philanthropy. But nevertheless, I created the Rockefeller tier. You are, I hear you cry, I know. But I now have 2 Rockefeller patrons. So it's a thank you to Thomas Carstens and Bart van Vonterhem for signing on. Welcome aboard. If you want to see what I'm on about, head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast. I do try to offer patrons a little bit extra each month. I can't always guarantee it, but we've had a good run this year so far. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. So, on to the main event. Joining me is Frederic Martini. His father was shot down over France in 1944 and was one of the Buchenwald Airmen. He's written about his father's experiences. The book is Betrayed. So, Rick, thanks for joining me. Shall we start with your father's wartime service? How did he end up in the Air Force?
He enlisted in August of 41, thinking that their war was on the horizon, and if he waited to be drafted, he'd end up doing something he didn't like, and he thought he'd get in early, and if there was no war, he'd be out in a year, because you only signed up for a year if you volunteered. And if a war did start, well, he'd have a leg up on seniority. So he went in, and he was being trained as a quartermaster and was going through camouflage and escape and evasion school in Ohio. And the 8th Air Force formed up and was calling for volunteers. My dad, according to him, got a rumor that they really ate well. And my dad was a hungry guy, and he probably also liked the uniforms, and he signed up. Because he wasn't a college graduate, he got tracked into gunnery and flight crew. He was mechanically very skilled, so he also ended up doing air mechanic training for B-24s and B-17s. And then he got assigned to flight crew in MacDill Air Force Base down in Florida and Tampa.
It amazes me how many of these guys, before they introduced conscription or anything, how many of these guys in the US volunteered. They as well, because they knew what if war came, they knew what must have been coming, because they could see it happening at all right, they're at a distance, but it's reported in the press what's happening to the British and the Germans and everybody. Yet they still chose to volunteer, believe don't want to miss it, or I'll get in before I'm forced in. One kind of assumes that you might think I'll just hang on as long as possible, but I guess there is that phrase, the greatest generation, isn't there? They put themselves forward.
My dad had done some traveling before, but for a lot of the people who signed up and who were part of his air crew, they hadn't been very far from home in the past. They had so many places they went once they signed up. I mean, they did basic training, and then they did gunnery school. That was in Florida, and then the mechanics school in Mississippi, and then up to Oklahoma for familiarization with the airplanes, and then down to Tampa to get assembled, and then flying multiple stops along the East Coast on the way out of the country.
In retrospect, a dreadful name for your father's plane, but they decided to call it Crash Wagon.
Yes. One of the most enjoyable parts of assembling all this was spending several days with Lauren Jackson, who was my dad's pilot. He said they tried really hard to come up with a name First, they tried the last letters of the last name, but there weren't enough vowels. So then they tried home states, and I think the only thing they could come up with was naked women with a Y instead of the E in naked. And he thought that probably the nose art would be really a little risque. So then somebody came up with the idea, well, they would just call it Crash Wagon. Little did they know that would be a very apt name.
Now that's just the first crash. So what this is just the first crash wagon. You can tell it. So what happens to the first crash wagon?
So the first crash wagon was the one that they were delivering to the European theater, and they got as far as the UK, and the landing gear shaft was frozen to the point where when they tried to get the gear down, the shaft fractured. So they couldn't get the gear down. So they dropped the ball turret in a lake and then came in and did a belly landing. The plane survived, but obviously they weren't going to have anything to do with it after that. So that was the first crash wagon. And then they got assigned to the 385th Bomb Group in Great Ashfield. They did a training period when new air crews would arrive. They get split up and assigned to experienced crews as fill-ins, and they do 2 combat missions just to kind of get the ropes, and then they'd come back together and go off on a formal mission on their own. So they got assigned a plane called In the Mood. It had already been named, but they said, "Oh well, we all walked away after Crash Wagon went down. That must be a lucky name, so we'll call this one Crash Wagon 2." So they went off on their mission and were coming back. They'd been shot full of holes from flak, and they had an engine on fire, and they ended up ditching in the English Channel. They got out okay and got picked up by a rescue crew from Brighton, and the plane sank, and so there went Crash Wagon 2. So then they got another plane, and that plane they called Crash Wagon 3, and they did a number of missions in that, and it all went well. And they had developed quite a good reputation for accuracy in their bombing. They had a really good bombardier. And so they got assigned to lead crew school, and their usual ride got taken out of service to be primped up for training as one of the lead crew. But the schedule didn't get revised. And so they got awakened for a mission when they thought they had a day off. And they decided, well, they needed more missions because they wanted to get their 25 was the criterion at the time. They wanted to get their 25 in and go home. So they said, okay, we'll go whatever plane. And they assigned them another plane. It had formerly been named Junior, but they called it Crash Wagon 3. That was their final ride. That was their 10th mission. So 10 missions, and they'd gotten through 3 planes. 9:06 in the morning on June 12th, the plane went down.
What amazes me, well, I was quite surprised that, up to that point, it's actually quite an intense schedule. They'd flown, in 18 days, they'd flown 12 times and 8 combat missions when they lost their second plane. So they've lost 2 planes. They're flying intensively. I mean, it must have been, we all know it's a strain for them, but partly up to this point, I sort of got the feeling that your dad was not unenjoying his, this sort of initial part of his service. I was just quite surprised at how sort of intense it had all been, for an experience for such a short period of time.
When he arrived, they were told that it would, in a month or so, they would either be dead, going home, or a prisoner of war. The plane cycle and the air crew cycle was just And this wasn't the worst of it. I mean, the worst of it was February of that year when the losses were astronomical. The Luftwaffe was not as big a threat at this point. The major threat, May, June, July, was anti-aircraft fire. Secondary was fighter planes. It's not that big an outfit. And when you're losing a plane on a mission, it impacts the whole group. The stress of that, getting yourself up in the morning, day after day. There were some days on D-Day in that period where they were doing back-to-back missions. The wear and tear mentally must have been really severe. But I suppose if you're in your 20s, you figure you're immortal, and that probably helps.
So what are the circumstances of the being shot down?
They were in the high element of the high group, but they were tail end Charlie. They were the plane that isn't surrounded by other planes, kind of lagging in the squadron. And as luck would have it, the anti-aircraft fire came up and found them up there and hung with them. And they lost 2 engines. They tried dropping their bomb load to reduce the weight and try to stay up with the formation, but that wasn't working real well. And then the second round of ACAC that hit them, one wing caught fire. They couldn't feather the prop, and so the bailout order was given, and out they went. My dad had been hit by shrapnel, so he had been hit he had a graze on his head, a hole through his calf, so he was a little bit out of it. But he and his friend, fellow waist gunner, Sam Pinnell, managed to get the ball turret gunner out of his turret. They beat the waist door open because the airframe had distorted, and so the door was jammed. And they could see that the tail gunner, Theo DeBennick, had already gone out, and they just assumed that the radio men had gone out through the bomb bay because that was the standard practice. So off they went. At that point, they were at probably 21,000 feet. The bombardier and the captain and the radio men all made it out okay. The navigator had a chute malfunction. He went flying by the co-pilot and just died on impact. Any way it went, he was a young guy. He'd been with another air crew. He'd done 28 missions with another air crew, and he'd done 1 mission with the crash wagon crew. After this mission, he was going to go home, but luck was against him.
In some respects, your father has luck with him insofar as they're picked up by the French resistance.
He and Sam Pinnell had discussions about what they would do if they were ever shot down. There were 2 schools of thought. One was you wanted to get your chute open as quickly as possible, but that had a downside in that it made you really visible. The other option was to wait, and they had decided that they would wait. So Sam waited until he was down a few thousand feet off the ground and then opened his chute. But my dad was unconscious after he left the plane, and he just happened to wake up very low, 1,500 feet, something like that, and rolled over and saw a town rushing up, as he put it, a church steeple coming up to meet him, and he opened his chute. And so he and Sam both landed many kilometers away from where the rest of the crew landed. And the rest of the crew were picked up by German patrols basically immediately. It was just Sam and my dad, and they were separated by about 10 kilometers where their landing sites were. But my dad was found right away. Farmer had his friend's son bury my dad's uniform, and then they rolled him up and got him into a horse-drawn water tank, and they moved him to a safe house inside the water tank, and German patrols didn't find him.
He arrives there to find this. Is it 3 other airmen hidden away with him?
Yes, once he got moved from the first place to Hockville, there were 2 other airmen with him. There was one of them there when he arrived, and then a second one was stashed there a couple of weeks after he arrived. So there was another American, and there was an RAF airman.
I mean, they must be aware that parachutes had come down. I mean, were they specifically looking for them, or if I don't like to use the word safe, were they relatively safe? But were they under imminent threat of being searched for?
There were constant patrols. German military army troops were coming through every week or so and doing searches that were thorough but not extremely aggressive. Over the course of the summer, the SS got more involved, and particularly after July 20th and the assassination attempt on Hitler, they were really and they were coming in and doing really teared up searches. And the airmen would hide. My dad and the other guys would go up and hide in the church bell tower up above the bell in a little crawl space and just wait for the patrols to go through. And they would sleep in a hollow space between the floors in the church. So in the ceiling of the church, there was a little gap that you could get into, and they'd sleep in there. So they had hidey holes that they would go into as needed. The town sheltered a lot of airmen. It was a very small town. It was only 400 people, but they did an incredible job. And the Roulins, Max Roulin was the head for communication and coordination for the resistance in that province. He was also the schoolmaster, so they spent part of their days in the school, and they ate meals with the family. But then they'd spend their nights either in the pastor's house or in the church itself.
Presumably, he couldn't speak French. He was on a rapid learning curve.
He was in a rapid learning curve. He ended up being pretty fluent in basic French, but he spent his days with the Roulin's 5-year-old son because he really liked kids. He and the son, it was kind of a natural tutoring there, and so he picked up a lot of stuff that way.
He's not a fluent French speaker. Why did he decide to leave what seems like some sort of relatively safe hiding and head to Paris? Because one would have thought Paris could be the centre of any fighting. So why? They must have been aware the Allies were. I mean, at this point they were certainly creeping closer. Is the best you kind of say.
Yes, they were. They definitely weren't leaping.
No, we hadn't got that gallop yet where they just shot across France. But why head to Paris?
There was a traitor who was an SD agent for the Germans. He was known throughout the whole Normandy area. He was in charge of ferreting out Allied airmen being sheltered within the network, within the resistance network. He was well known. He was trusted, and he started spending more time with the Roulins and telling the airmen that he'd been getting evaders out of the country through the Comet Line, a network either being flown out or being routed out through Spain, and that he'd been doing this regularly. He had a list of names, and he felt that this was their duty to do this because the war was going on. The Allies were still held close to the beaches, and if they wanted to get back in the fight, this was the way to do it. And Max was adamant that they should stay in place. They'd been able to shelter them so far. They just keep hiding them, and sooner or later the Allies would break through, and then they'd be okay. But there were atrocities happening at that point. They'd started in June, where entire French villages were being killed for offenses against primarily the SS, but Hitler's orders regarding the treatment of offenses against the German military were increasingly draconian. The airmen with Max, they heard about this stuff. So it was not only that they were being led to believe they had a moral obligation to take a chance and try to get back to Allied lines, but they also had a feeling that if they stayed and if they were caught, everybody that they knew, and perhaps the whole town, would be killed in reprisal. So that combination is what made him decide that they would take Jean-Jacques' suggestion and head for Paris.
And a fateful suggestion, really, because they're pretty instantly picked up, aren't they? Obviously, with the traitor in the midst, and it's Avenue Foch they're sent to, isn't it? Which is the Gestapo headquarters in Paris.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, they're dressed as civilians, presumably. Presumably they still have the American name tags on it. I mean, are they interrogated? What's treatment like for them?
They were thumped fairly thoroughly. My dad lost a couple of teeth. He was kicked and knocked unconscious. They wanted them to give them details, and if they didn't give them details about their units and their whatever else they knew about military operations, then they would be treated as spies and be executed. Nobody gave up the information, so they were sentenced to death and sent to Fraynes prison outside of Paris to await execution.
Yeah, and there's funnily enough, prison's come up a few times talking to people. They seem to have sent SOE people there as well.
Yes, they had. In fact, they had one of the wings of the prison was. They kind of had a lot of the SOE people were clustered there.
Is it the Allies finally make their breakthrough, and so the Germans decide to evacuate the prison, which. I'm sure I've said this before in one of the earlier podcasts. It amazes me that they bother to evacuate the prison in some respects, because it seems like a lot of resources they have to put to one side to shift these people.
Yes. On the other hand, it wasn't just the airmen and the SOE people they were going to move. They were going to move 2,300 French civilians who were going to be parceled out for slave labor. And Germany had an ongoing labor requirement that they were unable to fill. So they were basically vacuuming up human resources, and they weren't going to leave them behind and miss that opportunity. So the same train that carried the Buchenwald Airmen also carried, I think it was 2,100 civilians, plus the government of occupied France, so the officials from the government and the ranking German officers and SS guys. So this was the last train to get out of Paris before Paris fell.
Now, I was just sort of touching. That's a lot of people on that train. Now, they're not carriages. They put these prisoners in. I said, well, they are clearly carriages, but they're not passenger carriages. They're putting those classic. You see them in the war films. Those box cars, don't you? I have a picture in my mind of the box cars in some war film, and I can't think what the film is. Anyway, so yes, it's those box cars, and they just push them in, don't they? They just cram these guys in these box cars.
Yeah, just cram them in. 60 to 90 people per car. And every other car had guards and floodlights and machine guns. So they didn't want anybody to get away. But it was a really long train as a result. And into each car with up to 90 people in it, there would be a 20-liter bucket of water and a 20-liter empty bucket for wastes. And that was it, if he could get to the bucket. So basically, these people were standing for 5 days as the train made its way into Germany. And they had to change trains once because a bridge had been blown out. So then they had to forced march them on a roundabout route, and they had to carry all the belongings of the ranking officers and the politicos and the guards. They were very hungry and very tired.
Now, they evacuate them to Buchenwald, and that's not Stalag Buchenwald, it's Buchenwald, the concentration camp. Has the Germans classified them as, well, what are they classified as? Prisoners of war? Or
they were officially classified as police prisoners. They were to be treated as spies. So their military affiliations were simply not recognized. They made multiple attempts to rectify that. The leader, the ranking airman, Philip Lamison, repeatedly brought this up, but he was bringing it up to SS officers. And really, the SS didn't like the Luftwaffe, so they certainly weren't going to like Allied airmen.
This is completely and utterly against the conventions, the Geneva Conventions, isn't it? The way they're treated. I mean, give us an overview of what they're treated like what's life like for them when they first arrive in the camp.
The camp was extremely overcrowded at that point. It had probably 60,000 prisoners in it. They were assigned to Little Camp, which was a quarantine compound inside of Buchenwald. And it was a compound used for prisoners who were quarantined or prisoners who were in transit or would be executed relatively soon. So there were 12,000 prisoners in Little Camp, and it was way too crowded for them to be given any interior space. They had some converted stables that would hold 750 to 1,500, 1,200 prisoners, but those were all full. So they were just left to their own devices outside. They grouped together and stayed in an area that they called the rock pile. And they just slept on the ground outside for weeks. They were given a pair of pants, a shirt. Some got a kind of a light coaty thing without buttons rather than a shirt. No shoes, little caps, little striped caps, and something between a blanket and a towel for every 3 or 4 prisoners. And that was it. So within 2 weeks, they were already in deteriorating condition with respiratory problems, and their medical condition by over the time they were there was just awful.
It's really dog-eat-dog existence. There seems no camaraderie between the groups within the prison.
The SS had a control system where they would patrol the perimeter, and then they would leave enforcing rules to groups of prisoners. And so there was a hierarchy of power within the prison population. And then within the groups, it was dog eat dog. And the weak were eliminated fairly quickly in that scenario. And what really saved the airmen was their military background. Because in the first day, the officers in the group got together, decided who was the senior officer. They set up a chain of command. They set up squads. and they started thinking about escape plans. Squadron leader Lamison basically said, look, we're military. We don't belong here. We're going to remind them that we're military every day we're here. We're going to march when we're told to go somewhere. We're going to behave ourselves as a unit. It's going to be no squabbling. We're going to have patrols for security, squads in charge of assignments. They organized themselves up, and that held them together, and it gave them a plan, and it gave them hope, which otherwise they would surely have lost.
Yeah, it struck me as one of those strange things when you get here of ships sinking and one lifeboat no one can get out of, and the other lifeboat that went down at the same time, they all spring out as though nothing happened. There's something about giving people something to do that pulls people together and keeps them going, which is certainly seemingly what he manages to instill in them. Though it's just 38 days before the first airman dies of his treatment there. 38 days doesn't seem very long to have been there before the mistreatment, poor food, poor conditions seems to take over.
It was a goal of Little Camp. They expected prisoners in Little Camp to lose 30% of their body weight before they decided what they'd do with them. That made them more tractable, I guess. The sanitation was terrible. The food was terrible. Everybody had dysentery. Everybody had scabies. Everybody had lice and fleas. Scurvy symptoms are coming in. They'd been outside in the rain. It was turning cold. All kinds of pleurisy. Everything advanced. The deterioration of their health was really accelerated under those conditions.
And this includes your father, who almost has what sounds like the most horrendous ad hoc surgery.
They were prepared to do ad hoc surgery. He had an attack of acute appendicitis in addition to his other problems. He was delirious for a time. If he was given over to the Germans, to the SS, he would have simply been executed. So they held him in a hospital tent, they called it, which was just a place out of the weather where he would get checked on by an orderly. They didn't really have any medications or anything. So it was a case of, well, you stay here, and if you're lucky, you get better. And if not, you'll die here. At least you won't get a phenol injection in the chest, which was the usual way of putting him down. They were preparing to try an operation on him with a spoon that had been sharpened to make a scalpel. But fortunately, before they actually started cutting, he recovered enough to regain his senses, and he ended up getting back in with the rest of the guys. Turned out later that his appendix had burst and had gotten walled off in a pocket of mesentery. So for years afterward, he would have periodic bouts of abdominal pain and systemic infections from this.
I hadn't even realised that was possible. I thought if you burst appendix was pretty fatal unless you could be seen. I didn't realise that your body had even such a mechanism for coping with it.
Yeah, well, it's not common. I can say that. So he was lucky and tough, which is a good combination.
Yeah, was he just? But they do get out. I did make a note of how long they're there. Is it 61 days they're there for?
Yes, it was. It was roughly 9 weeks. It was in the 9th week that they got
So
out.
how did they get out? How, who gives the order to get them out?
In late August, while the airmen were still sleeping outside, the 8th Air Force bombed the military factories, the armaments factories that were attached to Buchenwald and that used slave labor to build weapons and also the guidance gyroscopes for V2s and V1s. It basically decimated the plants. And so there were a bunch of groups coming through looking at the damage. And over this same period, Squadron Leader Lamison had passed messages out of the camp to a Luftwaffe base, which was several kilometers away from Buchenwald, pleading with whoever was in charge, pleading with them to evacuate the airmen because at this point they were in very dire straits. 80% of them at one point had been in and out of the hospital tent. They were so weak that any escape plans had basically been given up because they would just be too weak to do anything. The Luftwaffe, of course, had a very checkered history with the SS. Word was passed up the chain of command. An air officer, Hans Trautloft, did an inspection of the camp, ostensibly to see about damage to the gyroscope factory and the armaments plant, but also to check on the rumors that there were Allied airmen held there. And there were among the airmen men who spoke German. And when this Luftwaffe officer came by, very distinctively uniformed and bemedaled, they called out to him, gave him a formal salute, and told him of their situation. And he promised to investigate further and see what could be done. It was a couple of weeks after this that German Luftwaffe officer showed up and brought the airmen together, talked to them about their forthcoming evacuation. They ended up sending a train to pick them up. 155 of the airmen made that train. There were 12 airmen who were too sick in the hospital tent to move, and they would follow over a period of a month. But they were evacuated and then taken to Stalag Luft 3.
Which must have seemed like a holiday camp compared to Buchenwald.
Well, it absolutely did. The reports from Stalag Luft 3 were interesting because traditionally the arriving prisoners at Stalag Luft 3, the prisoners who were already there would gather around to see him, and they almost enjoyed the shock on the faces of the arrivals because they'd see how grubby and, not looking very military the prisoners in Stalag Luft 3 seemed. And here there all of a sudden comes in a group of guys who look like they are starved to death. They're sick. They're having trouble walking. People's feet are swollen, and they have huge ulcers, skin ulcers that go all the way to the bone, untreated. They're just horrendously abused. And to the arriving prisoners, they look at these guys around, they go, wow, they look so healthy. So the whole situation, the perception was reversed.
Yeah, it must have been very disorientating for your father to be taken out of one regime which is so harsh at Buchenwald to something which is much more structured at Stalag Luft 3, running very much more to some sort of military order.
It was a great relief. And the medical care, he was in and out of care for a month, for his first month there. He was given vitamins. They had basic drugs to treat the skin conditions. The thing that he found most disconcerting was that he couldn't really talk about what had happened to anybody other than fellow airmen from Buchenwald, in part because people didn't really believe it. If they did believe it, in the aftermath of the Great Escape, there was so little trust and confidence in the Germans that if it became widely known what had been done to these airmen, there was a real risk of an uprising in the camp. And the senior officers in the camp felt that it was much better for them to sit tight because they knew the Russians were making great strides toward the camp, and there was a chance that they would be liberated, whereas if a premature uprising would probably result in their execution, mass executions. So this was the first time where he just decided it was best to keep his mouth shut about what had happened.
If that hasn't all been enough, I mean, you talk about the Russians coming closer. I think they're almost within the sound of gunfire, but the Germans evacuate Stalag Luft 3. So it's not the end of his trials and tribulations. He's not very fit, and there's a march out of the camp, basically. It's a pretty torrid affair, and it must be even worse for the Buchenwald Airmen, who are already in a poor physical condition.
Yep. The guys from South Camp, where my father was, where the South Compound, they were at the front of the line. There's 12,000 POWs marching through the worst winter conditions that Europe had seen in a decade. Temperatures well below zero. For the first 2 days, blinding snow. The first real rest stop wasn't for 27 hours. Talk about the walking wounded. They had perhaps a half hour to get ready to leave. And then they'd been drilling, they'd been talking about the possibility that they'd be evacuated and what might be done to prepare for that. But no one anticipated that they'd be going in a blizzard on a half hour's notice. So it was a rather chaotic.
It's chaotic, partly because we're not helped by the fact that the Germans don't really know where they're going. There's a lot of wandering around. They've not planned any resupply. It's a farce. It's a very peculiar thing.
And the different compounds ended up going somewhat different routes because people got lost. The Germans, as you say, they didn't have their routes planned. They took the wrong turn off here. They didn't have it. They didn't know they'd get to some place where there might be shelter, but they didn't know where that might be. They ended up one night in a glass factory, which they liked because the furnaces were on, so it was warm. There wasn't any arrangements for their feeding. The corpsmen in the group were having a terrible time keeping up with there were frostbite problems. There were incredible cases, blisters, terrible blisters, and just exposure. And yeah, it was a mess.
They arrive at Stalag 7, which is run by the army. Now, this is a very different affair than Stalag Luft 3.
7A at this point was receiving all of the POWs that were being moved from all of the other camps in areas that were being overrun by either the Russians or the other allies from the West. So it had started out as a holding place for officers, and it had a projected capacity of around 12,000. And at this point, it had around 120,000 prisoners. It was so overcrowded, people were sleeping outside the barracks, inside the barracks. They're building their own little camp stoves and burning parts of the siding from the buildings to heat water. And it was disorganized mess.
What ship's your father in at this point?
He was extremely weak. He still had bouts of abdominal pain. He'd lost all sensation in his feet. He'd lost 16 teeth. His ordinary weight was around 150, 160 pounds, and he was down around 100 pounds when he got in there. So he was back to what was probably his Buchenwald weight. And then they put him in forced labor teams and sent him to Munich to clear bomb damage.
Which it struck me as being an awful thing, a very difficult thing to do, because presumably you're clearing bombs in civilian areas, and you're the people responsible. You're not, the civilians would see you as being responsible.
Yes, and there was a risk of being killed by the civilians. And my father saw one of the other laborers killed by pitchfork. And they had to keep working even when strafing or bombing was going on, because the standing order was if you tried to take shelter, the German guards would shoot you. He finally figured, before he expired of this all, he figured by, it was April. He got there in February, beginning of February. But by April, he found that if he avoided the pickup gang that came through at about 5 a.m. to round up non-commissioned guys to go on forced labor details, that then he could act busy and not be bothered during the day. So he and ultimately a couple of other ex-Buchenwald airmen would spend the day moving things. Like my dad would pick up a mattress and carry it from one barracks to another, and then walk down and then carry it back. And that's, as long as you were busy and you weren't trying to escape, the Germans didn't pay much attention. So that was how we avoided the details toward the end.
I thought it was a wonderful story. Just keep, the appearance of looking busy. It's brilliant. So they are liberated at the end of April. How bad is your father at the end of April?
He was about as he had been. After the liberation of the camp, they were held there for a week and debriefed by war crimes investigators, and then flown to a medical evaluation station, and then on to Camp Lucky Strike near Le Havre. He spent several days in the hospital at the camp. They had a protocol where they would try to give you 4,000 calories, basically eggnog milkshake mixtures, and try to bulk the guys up. Because if they just let them eat, their digestive tracts wouldn't be able to cope with it. So they had to give them bunches of vitamins and then give them a controlled diet until they seemed to have enough stability that they could join the general population. After that period where he grew really tired of high-calorie milkshakes, they let him out into the general population. And the strategy there was they'd have the meal lines open for hours because there were so many guys to feed. The standing routine was you got in line, you waited, you got your food, and you carried it back to the end of the line, got in the line, ate your food while you waited to get back to the front of the line, and you do that as long as the chow line was open.
Bulks himself up. Now, he does get to the point where he actually feels fit enough to figure out what happened to him in Paris.
He was haunted by a fear that his French family, the Rolands, that something bad would have happened to them after he left, that the Germans might have come through and killed everybody in the village. He didn't know what might have happened. And he was also really irritated at Jean-Jacques, or whoever the traitor had been. He knew if it wasn't Jean-Jacques, there was only one other guy that he'd interacted with in Paris. So he decided that rather than wait for a ship to go back to the U.S., because he knew he was never coming back to Europe after the war, he was going to take off and go back and try to find the traitors, and then go to the Rolands and see if they were okay. So he stole a 45 from an MP and went AWOL and spent, I think it was a total of 10 days, hunting. And he went first to Paris, and it turned out that the contacts that he'd met in Paris, one of them was dead and one of them was on the run, but they were after him. Jean-Jacques was in the wind. So then he went back to Huckville to see the Rolands and found that that they were okay, and that actually they'd had airmen who arrived after, and Paul and Alex, the other airmen who'd been there, after they left. And those airmen had stayed with the Rolands, and they'd been liberated when the Allies arrived. So that pretty much proved to Fred that he'd made a bad decision.
It shows a certain bloody mindedness of your father to have to go through all that to think, right, I'm off back to Paris to try and track these buggers down.
Yeah, he was. That was my dad.
So, back at home, through the whole experience, had the family back at home, were they aware of anything that was going on with him from the moment he was shot down?
So between June and November, they heard nothing. In November, they got word from the War Department that he was a prisoner of war. Because once he got to Stalag Luft 3, he was in the system. Because Stalag Luft 3, the Red Cross did visits. There was a mail address for post to and from. So it was tied into the military system. Whereas as a civilian prison, Buchenwald was completely off the map. And no Red Cross, no oversight. Whatever went on there stayed there. All of a sudden, he popped up on the radar. They started sending letters to him, and he sent a couple of letters back. Most of the correspondence kind of dead-ended and ended up being returned to sender.
How did your father's experiences affect him? I mean, it was quite horrendous, really. Three very different camps, and Buchenwald, his treatment of Buchenwald was physically very difficult. So how did that all affect him mentally and physically after the war?
The holdover from Buchenwald was the worst. I think the rest of it, he was, a tough enough guy to deal with it. But the things he experienced and the treatment he had in Buchenwald really affected him long term. When he first came back, there were years where if he saw somebody in uniform out of the corner of his eye, his reaction was it was an SS uniform. I mean, he would just recoil. If there was a loud noise, he'd duck for cover. My mom used to talk about when they were on one of their first dates, and that would have been in June, late June of 45. They were walking down a street in New York, and a car backfired, and they were all dressed up for an evening. And the next thing she knew, she was being dragged under a parked car, and tearing her nylons. And 7 years later, he had a job interview where somebody on the shop floor dropped a pallet from a forklift and it made a bang. And he said the next thing he knew, he was under the desk looking at the legs of the guys who'd been interviewing him. So he didn't get that job. He had what now we would call some variation between chronic and acute PTSD that went on pretty much indefinitely.
But that's coupled with his poor physical, he had recurring bouts of physical problems.
He couldn't stand for any significant length of time. The reason he had no sensation in his feet was peripheral neuropathy, which can be caused by malnutrition. I don't know how much the cold of the march had to do with it, but probably a lot of it was malnutrition. The outside of his foot was numb, but he had a sense of burning pain inside his feet. So it hurt to put shoes on, it hurt to stand, and that made a lot of jobs that he otherwise would have gone after and made them impossible. He had to have a desk job of some kind. He was prone to, all of a sudden he'd get mad at something. And boy, when he got mad, I learned earlier than I can remember that you don't make your dad mad. He would never hit anybody. He wasn't abusive to the family, but boy, when he got mad, his face would freeze and he'd turn white, and there was an aura around him that you did not want to get into. Rule number 1 was don't talk about the war, and rule number 2 was don't talk about the war. So
now, the US government have never acknowledged that the airmen were at Buchenwald. So how did this affect your father?
Well, my dad, part of him being a stubborn bugger, he applied for benefits, for medical benefits. A year after he was discharged, he had another bout of abdominal pain, and they went in. He went into a public hospital on an emergency basis, and they opened him up, and they found that his appendix was burst but walled off in scar tissue in a pocket in the abdomen. It would have taken more than a year for that to even form. The surgery took 4.5 hours as opposed to a quick in and out for an appendectomy. And the U.S. government refused to pay for it, saying that, well, it had nothing to do with his military service, and that he hadn't been diagnosed with appendicitis when he was discharged. So he filed appeals, and he would continue filing appeals for one decision or another about his military experience in the war, all the way through when he died in 1995. He still had an appeal pending for medical coverage, compensation. He was worried about how my mom was going to deal with everything and bills and all that stuff. So he was not going to let them get away with not saying that he'd been there. I mean, his VA record says alleges POW, claims to have been at Buchenwald. He was basically treated as somebody who was either delusional or lying to get money that he didn't deserve out of the VA. And that really ticked him off. He just kept fighting them. And over that same period, after about 1983, when some of the documentation got declassified, the Kalb Club, which was a club that the airmen formed in Buchenwald in their first week at the camp, was kind of a way to say, boy, when we get out, we're going to have a club, we're going to get together. And they had officers for the club, they had a treasurer and all this stuff set up in advance. They had a logo. But then, of course, after the war, all their records were classified. Nobody knew where anybody else was. And the club didn't reform until the 1980s. And then when it did reform, it made a point of trying to get the federal government to acknowledge that, in fact, they'd been at Buchenwald. They managed to get a congressional act acknowledging it, approved by the House of Representatives in 1993, and it was killed by the Senate Judiciary Committee for unknown reasons. And then they tried again in 1995, and it got tabled, and then they tried again in 1997, And it was passed by the House of Representatives, and it went to the Senate, and again it got killed in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And at that point, that was 1999. By that point, most of the Buchenwald Airmen were dead, and the bill was never reintroduced.
So why was the American government, right from the end of the war, why did they refuse to acknowledge that there was any prisoners of war in Buchenwald?
It was tied in to an unfortunate overlap between Buchenwald and the Mittelwerk V2 factory and the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. All of the slave labor to construct the Mittelwerk plant was taken from Buchenwald. Skilled labor for the assembly lines was selected from prisoners at Buchenwald. The U.S., when they liberated the Mittelwerk and the V2s and the V2 components, they put a security blanket over everything having to do with it, so that this was not a subject for acknowledgement or discussion. And the records of the Buchenwald Airmen were classified, and they were classified to the point where the VA, when they did ask the Army for confirmation of my dad's stories, the Army said, "Oh, we don't have those records." And it was kept secret even from the war crimes prosecutors at the Buchenwald war crimes trials. At those trials, the prosecutors were asked, and it was Americans were in charge of that trial. They were asked if they could give the name of any POWs who'd been held at Buchenwald or any POWs who had died there, and they couldn't do that. The depositions that had been made by the Buchenwald Airmen in their debriefings by war crimes investigators and by the OSS, all that had been buried.
It's amazing. So you know that this has all been buried. You know, I guess at the start of the Cold War to bring across the German rocket scientist and Werner von Braun and his team. You know, and you compare his treatment. You know, and I'm pretty sure he would have been found as a war criminal at the end of the war if he'd been tried. You know, compare his treatment by the US government to your father's, who up until the end of his life was treated with skepticism. It seems most unfair.
Indeed it does. And
to put it mildly.
This was a part of the story that I was not aware of when I started doing the research for the book. I knew more about his problems than about what was going on behind the scenes and inside the government and the army. And von Braun, I focused on von Braun because my father claimed to have seen him at Buchenwald, and it is documented, in fact, in a letter signed by von Braun from August 44, that he had been to Buchenwald to select skilled laborers for the V2 line. It's not proven that he'd been there after that, but it's not proven that he hadn't been. And my dad was convinced that he'd seen him there. To have von Braun be treated as an icon and a hero is an incredible miscarriage of justice when you actually get in and look at what he did during the war and his behavior at the end of the war.
Because it's undoubted he was complicit in using slave labour, yet he offered himself up to the Allies. He obviously knew his value and basically sold himself.
Werner and Dornberger, General Dornberger, who was his his army connection. They both had a sense of invincibility because they knew that the Allies wanted their technology, and they did not believe that anything bad would happen to them. So they were intent on making the best deal they could after the war, and they didn't like the Russians. They never liked the Russians. So that was pretty much out. And they didn't think the British had enough money. The French were unlikely to have any kind of a rocket program, so they decided that their best option was to go with the Americans. They discussed it, but they waited until it was really obvious that the war was going to be lost, and then they took steps to divorce themselves from any taint of war crimes by getting physically far away from Dora and the Middle Works and where von Braun's headquarters were at the time, which was Bleacher Road, which is right outside of the Nordhausen, Dora area. So they got well away from there. After surrendering to the military, to the Army, U.S. Army, von Braun just lied and lied and lied and lied. And he was always prone to self-aggrandizement and overselling his abilities and his projects. In this instance, he simply made stuff up. The interviews that he gave when he was interrogated, I mean, it's all fabricated. But he was very sure that nobody was going to be able to catch him out on it, because before setting all this in motion, he'd taken all the documents and the plans of 14 tons of documents and had them crated up and had his subordinates take them to a secret location and bury them in an abandoned mine. So as far as he could determine, he knew everything at the Middle Works all the paperwork was burned before that site was abandoned. And the other materials from his office at Bleacher Road, those had all been crated and buried. So basically, whatever he said must be the truth. And that was how he approached it.
What amazed me was, so your father thinks he saw him at Buchenwald. He did meet him post-war, curiously. How did he feel about von Braun?
He was incredibly conflicted. I mean, he called him a jackbooted Nazi bastard a few times. He was a realist, and he knew he was not in a position where he could upbraid von Braun, because he was working at the time for a company that made high-tech switches for the Apollo program. And there had been that fatal fire in a capsule in training. One of the possibilities was that it was a problem with the switches. So he went to Huntsville as part of the investigation process and start slinging aspersions at von Braun under those circumstances would be extremely ill-advised. So he swallowed his urges and simply said, "Oh, nice to see you again," and hoped that would stimulate some thought, but probably.
Now, it's not just your father. You're in New Zealand now. How did the New Zealanders treat, like Squadron Leader Philip Lamison and some Brits there? I mean, was the whole debacle buried worldwide for the Allies?
It basically was for a variable length of time, depending on which country. But because of the way the war crimes trials were structured, anything to do with crimes committed at Buchenwald, all those files were given to the U.S. from all of the Allied powers. So all of the records of all of the Buchenwald Airmen ended up going to the U.S. government. That was why even though one of the airmen who died in Buchenwald was British, the war crimes prosecutors were unaware of it. And the British government, as with the American government, in the summer of 45, published a report saying that there were no POWs held in German concentration camps. And that was the party line, and that's still the only official statement from the U.S. federal government is a congressional report from August of 45 that makes that flat statement, which was often cited when people told my dad he was imagining things.
It's remarkable that they can still hang out, hold out. What's the point in any now? I mean, everybody must be dead who was there, or within at the end of their life. It's amazing that the government holds on to that denial. I wonder what they think the point is.
Governments are disinclined to acknowledge mistakes and errors of judgment and things that are potentially embarrassing. They would sooner park them away and pretend they never happened. And of course, another 25 years goes by when the children of the Buchenwald Airmen have passed on. There's going to be very little to bring this to anybody's attention, and no real motivation. I mean, some of the files in the UK are classified for 75 years. They might open up 2020. Even things that are declassified. I was trying to get a file from the Q archives. The explanation I was given as to why it wouldn't be released was that the file had been obtained from another government, which I would assume would be the U.S., and that revealing it would be potentially embarrassing to the other government and affect relations with the British.
You're almost looking at the 100-year rule, which will declassify everything. And that's after everyone involved will have passed away. You now will be long gone. Well, that seems like a fitting place to bring this to a close. Thanks for that. It was great. If you want to read more about the Buchenwald Airmen, the book is Betrayed by Frederic Martini. As usual, I will put a link on the website. Don't forget, if you use Facebook, you can find me there, WW2Podcast. Give the page a like. I do regularly post things in support of the latest podcast. It's great to get comments which open up discussion. I think that's it for now. We should be in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, I think, for our next outing. I'm Angus Wallace. Over and out.